Okay. So we've talked about the research question and why we might be doing some form of stated preference. Now the next thing is these tasks. We've showed a couple of different types of tasks. The alluded to several other formats of tasks that we could have. But we can kind of see here that the construction of task, the experimental design, and the method by which you elicit the preferences are all in kind of like some meta concept here that's kind of stuck together, because you don't want tasks that are inconsistent. Sorry.
Lost you on that.
The construction of tasks, you don't want it inconsistent with the experimental design that you're using or the preference elicitation. So if you're using, for example, best-worst scaling, that's going to have a mechanism by which how you would want to choose the task. So we talk about appropriateness here. For those of you that don't know some of how to do this, how do you judge what appropriateness is? Well, we've talked about the number of attributes in each of the conjoint or discrete choice experiment tasks. Sometimes there are things called partial profiles incorporated in there. The number of scenarios in a task. So are we doing paired? Are we doing a single task? Are we doing triplets or more? And how many tasks should go on an instrument? And again, that is a function of the experimental design, but as we get back to focusing on the experimental design, different numbers of tasks will have an impact on the types of experimental design. So they kind of feed back off one another. So when we think about how many attributes here, we really do see this 5 to 7 kind of dominating in there. There are other types of instruments such as best-worst scaling case 1 that could focus on having more attribute levels, more attributes because they don't have levels. But I think this is kind of like a good area to kind of think about. There are some extremes I've seen potentially as up as 24 attributes in a study. So the majority are in this range, but we can kind of see some breakdown. 4 to 5 is probably where I'm at in my analyses these days, although sometimes I'll move out to 6 to 7. Some consulting companies kind of bring me in as a hired gun when a client may want to do 8 or 9 attributes, or some other people who have done 8 or 9 attributes call me in to say, can you fix this once the experiment is done? Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. But in my shop, as I said, one of these designs is going to be the focus. We don't see that much variation over time, except we see these kind of like very large experiments have kind of diminished, particularly with our good research practices kind of focusing in on this. Somebody asked about a small number of attributes. 4, I used to have an aversion to 4 or lower. I now play in the 4 space. If the discrete choice experiment has 2 fewer attributes, the probability that you can just know the answer, it's very hard to get a trade-off going in so few attributes. If you were in the 2 to 3 attribute range, potentially a discrete choice experiment is not the tool. Brett talked about some other types of trade-off. We might just present, let's say it's 3, we might present 2 of the attributes deterministically and then bid across the last attribute to kind of like saying, you know, this is a no-brainer. The starting point is a no-brainer. Everyone should accept this. But as I increase the toxicity or I increase the chance of a serious side effect, when would you stop accepting? And then we looked at that threshold, and we can look at that threshold across different people. If I was in the 10 or more, I'd be saying, for simplicity, I would drop the attribute levels and just focus on the attributes, and there are some tools that can focus on that. how many of these can you present to a particular respondent? This comes from a systematic review that Deborah and I and Brett did. You can see that we've been working together for some time to do this. There was some kind of focus originally around this 8 mark that people said, yeah, 7 to 8 seems to feel right, that this is the most that people can do. There was some work by Joanna Coast where she did a randomized, I'll get it to say, a randomized experiment where she did 16 or 8 and showed that the group that did 16 tasks and the group that did 8 tasks had no difference in preferences. So from then, we kind of said 16 seems to be right. There are some people that want to go out. Jordan Louviere is now suggesting that we can go out into the 30s. I bought into that for a while, but I've actually moved from 16 back to 9 or 10. A question at the back. That's the task. The thing we'd normally present it on a single page. Remember those couple of tasks that I showed you from the other thing? That's the number of tasks. Generally, in a discrete choice experiment, we've settled on 2 profiles within a task, so we're going to use that. If it was a best-worst scaling, we would present just a single task, and within that ask what is the best attribute or the worst attribute, or if it was best-worst case number 1, we would set a subset of the items and go through that. But whatever the task that we've settled on is, this is the number of tasks that we can get away with. Well, a task could have more than one decision. So, for example, a best-worst scaling task would present a single profile and say, what is the best aspect on this page and what is the worst aspect on this page? A best-worst case number 3 would say, here are 4 treatments, what's the best treatment, what's the worst treatment, and may even go to ask, what is the next best, so that you could get a full order ranking. So remember, Brett suggested that our task could involve a rating, ranking, or choice amongst the set. So whatever those tasks are on a page, but these are fundamentally how many different pages we can present to people.
It would seem to me that the number of tasks you can give people is going to be related to the cognitive burden of the individual task.
Okay. We talk a lot about cognitive burden, and I realized a couple of years ago that I actually knew nothing about cognitive burden. I'd testified in different environments about cognitive burden, and I was like, I really don't know what I'm talking about here. And cognitive burden is assisted by or counteracted by emotional connectiveness to the question in hand. It is why are you doing this study? So, for example, a patient-centered researcher might be able to get somebody to do a lot more tasks than, say, a company who's just coming in and doing it, and is never going to talk to that patient again. So there's a lot of different things in play that are not. So in a recent study, I really minimized the cognitive burden and got junk. And went, oh my God, and then I ended up breaking the survey into 2 and doing 2 surveys and made it, I had warm-up tasks, I increased the number of tasks, I had open-ended boxes to let people get off their chest what they wanted to get off their chest, and the satisfaction. Also, I'm not sure they have any satisfaction. We ask some questions now about how satisfied with the survey were you? How are you getting your preferences? And we see respondents on that, and it's not just about burden. Sometimes you want the least burdensome is Likert scales. We just, as part of the Bakori study, showed Likert scales versus best-worst case 1, showed the results back to the respondent, said, which one of these do you believe? They said best-worst scaling is more believable results. And then the next question was, if you had to do this all over again, would you want to do best-worst scaling or Likert? They went back and said, no, we want to use Likert, even though they rejected the results. So that's problematic. So we have to make a whole heap of trade-offs. Brett, you had a point?
Yeah, to the cognitive burden point, I don't think, I am
this is related to cognitive burden, but what I look for in number of tasks is when, if I'm doing a pencil and paper version in this face-to-face, or even on a computer, how many more are there? If they start looking and seeing, that's when I know I'm hitting a limit for that particular individual that's telling me the data I get after this question is going to start getting noisy. So it's a pragmatic approach to at what point do I start getting noisy data because people are getting tired. And that's not the same as cognitive burden. So it's more of a pragmatic, given what I have, what I want to accomplish, what can people realistically do, and maybe I can push that a little further. And there's a school of thought in the marketing literature that if I ask enough questions, and I think this is where Jordan Louvier is coming from, if I get into the 30s, I'm going to have lots of noise, but I'm going to have lots of observations, and that's going to offset the noise that I get. So it's a research judgment, but nothing in my mind beats sitting down with respondents before you put this into the field and test drive it. Because you're going to learn some of these things that, oh, this is not working. I don't have a scale to say I'm checking off this on this particular thing, but I know when I start seeing 10 people after 6 questions saying, you know, how many more of these do I have, that starts to tell me when it's not going to work any longer. So it's much more of a pragmatic criterion than a theoretical.
Well, which brings up another question. How important is it that the participants do all of the tasks in one session?
It's variable. So the longest, I did a study with Brett a couple of years ago, and I think the longest duration to do the choice sets went from something like 3 minutes to almost 1,000 minutes. So you can put benchmarks to see what's in there. Some people might a priori put some maximums and minimums on how much you allow somebody to do it, but people can come backwards and forwards. We encourage this in our survey. So we focused on this issue of fatigue rather than burden. Fatigue is a notion that people disengage for this. So for example, on one of my recent studies, it wasn't cognitive burden, it was emotional burden. That the questions that we had, we actually ended up having, because of our pre-testing, we had some people break down, and we went to our community advisory board and said what we did additional consent. So we said, the survey has been difficult up until now, but the next section is really, really difficult, and people have had emotional problems with it. If you would like to end now, we ended up in that study about 20% of people stopping at that point, because we had to balance ethically upsetting people. Other questions, I have a survey out in the field at the moment that is really upsetting, but is providing really important data. And we've had to do the same, but we're tracking data on it, and people are still upset with it, but they find it relevant. So there are kind of different issues. We do want to maximize the amount of information that we want to get from a patient. Potentially, if we want to look at patient differences, we might have to get them to do a whole heap of questions. We could also break, imagine that our experimental design requires, say, 46 questions to be done. If that was the case, we might break it up into blocks and have people focus on a fraction. There are fractional designs, but even when you have the design, you can end up blocking that design. One of the problems there is we might end up observing a block effect, or we have the limiting capacity that we cannot estimate an individual's preferences. And that's where the literature potentially on hierarchical Bayes approaches or others where you have to kind of blend population estimates with individual estimates to be able to understand patient heterogeneity come into play. And there's some limitations in there. This I change opinions on about every 6 months. Okay. In the stuff that we've been presenting, we have been dealing with this, say, 6 attributes with 3 levels each. How many of those are there? I think 2,000? Okay. How many pairs can I make? 4 million. Then I'm going to ask 15 of these. So that's 4 million raised to the power of 15. If you put that in, if anyone's running R, the answer in R will come back infinity. Okay, and that was just me choosing 15. If I encountered all the other possible numbers, I would have got a much higher magnitude of infinity. So what we have to do is, one, have a fractional design, so we'll only end up choosing based on experimental design. Brett will go over experimental design in a moment, but we will end up choosing the minimum number of questions that we could have and still identify the model. But that may be more questions than an individual can respond to. And that's where we have this, how many should they get? So I was very much in the camp 2 years ago, everybody should see the same version of the survey. This year, I'm doing 3 blocks of 10. So instead of getting people to do 15 questions, I've gone to 30. That means I get better population estimates, worse individual estimates. Yes?
But when you were talking about the additional consent, which I find fascinating from my area of work, are you adding that additional like remuneration or incentive to continue? Or
None of my work, I mentioned this earlier, I don't pay people to do my surveys. So other people do, but I don't, because I work with patient organizations and they raise money from constituencies. I survey those constituencies. There are transaction costs associated with bringing the money in and sending it back out again. And quite often, many people will return and donate it back. So to minimize that, I've worked, and I also had to product differentiate myself from other groups. So I've just kind of said, I'm the person that doesn't reimburse.
As the person who often does. The answer would be no. Generally, we would say at the beginning, here's the incentive. It's usually pretty nominal. And you can stop at any time. So they can stop before that. So what I would do, John, re-consent is ethically based. But we've said at the beginning, you're coming into this, you can stop at any time after the first question. So from an ethics point of view, that is how I view it. And then this is, John's is saying, this has been tough, it's going to get harder, are you okay? So remuneration-wise, no, I wouldn't make a change.
Oh, I'm going to do experimental design and you're going to do analysis. So let's delve into experimental design. This is, I have a new K awardee, she's very bright. And I said to her, she's like, where can I find ever these experimental designs? I went, experimental design is a pit of misery. If you are going to enter into the world of experimental design, I expect that you might be there for the next 2 to 3 years. So be careful. If you want to learn this, yes, it will be empowering to come out of it, but I don't expect, she's the type of person that learns something in a week. I remember I was working probably for 5 years before I used to ask Brett to do my experimental designs because I didn't know how to do it. Or I worked on that very simple binary design, textbook-oriented designs, very simple experiments. But it wasn't until I started working with Brett that I learned how to do it. Interestingly enough, we've had a departure and we have now different strategies to do our designs. They approximate to be the same thing. Lo and behold, many of the design strategies end up presenting the same thing, but there are different paths to doing it. So again, the experimental design I want a specific task. I'm going to end up having a specific response. Some experimental designs, you also have to tell it which statistical analysis that you're going to use. You have to kind of put more information. The more information that we can go into this infinite pit of despair, the better the chances are that we can recover from it. When we wrote the original checklist, we kind of, a very explicit kind of like saying, we're going to write a checklist on how to do this. We probably don't know how to do experimental design. We probably don't know how to do statistical analysis at the time that we wrote the original checklist. We were too divergent in community. That's why we went on. We knew that they had to be additional checklists. Now that we've written those, we want to come back and say, hey, how are we going to reorganize this now that we know some more about this? Was your choice of experimental design? You mentioned the adaptive. Adaptive has been one of the reasons why I took in 2007, we had a little consensus meeting as to what are we going to call this thing, and I got views, stated preferences, discrete choice experiment. Went around the conference call, and I came back and said, no, we're going to call it conjoint analysis for two reasons. People in this society call it conjoint analysis, and those federally funded studies that have been done have been called conjoint analysis. It's probably a wrong term. There is a paper criticizing the use of conjoint analysis, but I wanted to be careful because there were still people, Sarah Hawley, others, Lisa Prosser, Liana Frankel, who were at this society, that were still using particularly adaptive conjoint analysis from Sawtooth. That was fine, but why did you do it? If you did it that's saying, I don't think that people can answer full profile questions, that in the literature has turned out probably not to be a good reason, because people will turn around and say, oh, here's a paper that looked at the exact same research question that you did, and they did do a full profile. So I don't want to maximize the burden. We also, the flip side of burden is relevance. And actually the FDA asks, have you demonstrated that your questions are relevant? It turns out that the full profile, the more realistic that you can make the decision, the more relevant it is to people. Because they can experience, particularly say for in cancer, that they've had to make these choices across a large array of things. So we have to put some justification in there, and there has been some limitations of people using different approaches, even my own work. I used to use a lot of 2-level experiments because I didn't know how to do 3-level experiments. That was probably a bad justification, and I probably did some papers that were probably not optimal, but it was part of my growth experience. Alternative experimental design. So now we use multiple different software packages to come up with multiple experimental designs, and we compare them. And we might even do some piloting of these to kind of like say what's working, what's not working. So for example, increasingly people want to use Bayesian experimental designs. That's where you have a good pilot and you put in what you think the answers are going to be. They're interesting designs, but sometimes they spit out unusual answers. And then in some of the work that we've done, so Brett and I work in a regulatory setting, if we got a question saying, is this because it's the true preferences or is this because of the experimental design? At this stage, I don't think both of us wouldn't, for some of the Bayesian experimental designs, we wouldn't know how to answer that. And that puts us in a hard place. So we probably, and a lot of people move around, classical designs that minimize the overlap, make things level so that there's not a left-right bias, that factors appear on the left and the right, and have some degree of orthogonality as much as you possibly can. If you start to take out the implausible combinations, you're going to take a hit on the orthogonality of the design. So if, for example, there are two factors and they cannot be at the polar extremes, then those two factors are going to be highly correlated. Imagine that that correlation is 60%. How well can you understand the individual estimates? If it's 20%, there's still going to be some factors and you're going to take a hit on the standard errors in some way. My comfort zone, and I'm not sure what Brett's is I will allow things to maybe be 10% correlated with one another. Sometimes I have to go up, there's just no possible way, and I have to accept 30%. But I have to put a big caveat on that, and I have to test what's going on to see if I'm getting rational answers before I move on. So I might stop the survey at, say, 100 participants and see what's going on. Joel Huber at Duke suggests, why just take a single strategy? All the strategies have risks. Why don't you mix strategies and have multiple experimental designs? That's interesting, very hard to execute when you say doing a pen and paper survey. A little bit easier when you have an electronic software that allows for you just to drop the experimental design and it makes the tasks for you. You had a question?
Yeah, do you use fractional factorials where you intentionally confound the interactions that leave the main effect orthogonal?
So mainly main effects is there, but one of the problems is the classic main effect designs only apply for a single profile. So main effects designs are these textbooks. If you go in and just do SAS orthogonal arrays, there is a whole catalog of this. They come from engineering when I wanted to think about making steel, and I could vary different aspects, the ingredients, the timing, the cooling process, and then I could do a strength test on it to see which turned out to be stronger. They were good because I was making single profile steels and I could test them. I wasn't putting two profiles out there and saying which is more aesthetically pleasing. It's the when you put two profiles together, all of a sudden orthogonal arrays, even though they have an underpinning, are less relevant. If I did triplets, I've moved much further away from orthogonal arrays, and I have to make sure that the underlying experiment might have orthogonality, and that's a higher order concept. One of the key people in experimental design is John Rose. He's developed a software called Engine. It is one of the dominant softwares internationally, particularly in Europe and Australia. SAS is still, and Sawtooth is still prominent also in the United States. He also is writing a paper saying that maybe we don't know anything about orthogonality, and that the statistical tests of orthogonality don't have anything to do with orthogonality in the brain or orthogonality in the task, and that's problematic. There is another researcher, Geoffrey Swait, who says all of these experimental designs are problematic. We can only present tasks that are more realistic. If it's not something that you would experience in the supermarket, then you just don't know how to answer it. So there is another type of experimental design that is called natural experimental designs. One of the problems with more natural experimental designs is quite often they're not identifiable. You can't go in and estimate all the parameters. But for some of my clients that come in, people come in and say, I want to compare this medical device with this drug. Oh, making a discrete choice experiment for that is really, really difficult. We can go through it. But if that's your research question, why don't I just tell them what the drug does, what the device does, and get them to choose? And maybe we could do that in several different things. First choice, some probabilistic. I can have some open-ended and some closed-ended questions about why you made the choice and make a survey like that. So direct elicitation is more natural, potentially more relevant, and you don't need an experimental design to do it. Or the experimental design is driven by generating a task that is the actual research question at hand. Is there any other questions? Yep. Yep.
And we would never dream of presenting something that's not plausible because it's for clinicians and these things don't exist in real life.
Yeah.
So I think the solution there is you decide to live with moderate intercorrelations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a choice.
I think we have had some successes in moving beyond that, but we have some of the exact same things, and we've also had some studies fail. Like we've got third-party vendors to do it, and they've come back and where people won't answer the question at all. And I was just like, maybe I remember one instance that we worked on together that happened, and I was just like, maybe you were uncomfortable asking the question, but maybe I wasn't, you know. Yes, people sit in front of me and screw their face up and might complain, but I'm driven by a higher order. I am driven by a democratization of decision making. So I sometimes just say, I know that this is going to be painful, but hey, I'm here with you. I can work with you, but I'm also going to share the results with you. I'm going to send the results to these people, and I get people to do things that they normally wouldn't do. So I like to push. I quite often say in past years here, I say, if your threshold for burden tolerance is our, let's say 100%, we benchmark across that, I probably would go to about 200, 250%. And I've had some successes. I've had get some complaints and I have to deal with them. But you know, I like to work out in that area because I'm trying to get this more holistic version of the model. Brett?
Experimental design is very important, and I don't want to suggest by what I'm about to say that it is not. But what I find is if we've developed a good survey in terms of something that works, where the questions work, and that's often we'll get to that point before we look at the experimental design. And we want to, and our research question is pretty clear, and we've designed a survey to look at our research question. We have lots of tools for experimental design that generally work pretty well. There is a school of researchers who get really deeply into some of the details that often are not relevant necessarily to what we are doing. When we're talking about the market researchers who are using this to predict market share down to the 5th decimal point of a percentage, that's a different thing than what we're trying to accomplish here. So we'll never get a perfect design, but we can get very good designs by looking at some of the basic criteria that John has already mentioned. So there's always a risk, because we're putting something out there, sometimes not knowing exactly how it's going to perform. But I think we have some basic principles to work by that are reflected in most of the different types of software. For the work that we do, that may not be appropriate for the predictions in market research in wine, for example, which John always does, where there's huge amount of money at stake and it's really being looked at, you know, where to invest in order to get your maximum return. Our question is a little bit different, and I think less reliant on some of those characteristics of the design than we see in market research. So we don't want to come away from this discussion of experimental design saying, oh my gosh, this is so risky, my study is going to fail if I don't nail it. We're never going to nail it. And the risk, I think, is lower here than it is for some of the market research applications where precision of the prediction is paramount. That's not necessarily what we're doing. John, do you disagree?
No, I think, and if you have the basic characteristic, the most important thing, if you're going to run a model, so if you choose to estimate all the parameters, you better check that those parameters are estimatable. There are some designs, even very prominent researchers that have followed strategies that have been replicated, that have led to models where the model won't work. It'll spit out variable X and variable Y are perfectly correlated with one another. The overspecification, no, it's just not going to work. There'll never be a chance. You either have to combine them and do it together. So there could be some back-end massaging that's necessary to make these things work. Generally, if you've got good principles, if you can get identifiability, everything else, so for example, some of them have tighter standard errors, but you could conflict the tighter standard errors by having a larger sample size. Some of those people, so for example, when you do this in legal, let's say you're presenting the results in court, there's a very specific process that you have to do to consent the individuals. And so there you are quite often spending hundreds of dollars per respondent. If you're using a large online panel or doing patient advocacy where I'm paying nothing per respondent, then I can probably just have more respondents rather than work on an experimental design that's going to give me a tighter fit on each individual model. So there are multiple things at play. And again, here, that's the difference between understanding an individual responses as opposed to an aggregate response. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I could use some clarification. You mentioned getting a survey that works and putting that together, and then we talk about experimental design separately. And it seems to me that there's a task of assigning to each profile the different levels of the attributes, and that can be viewed as an experimental design task.
That's what we're talking about.
Okay.
In this one, so the that array there is my experimental design.
Right, and that's where I would think that you could potentially use the fractional factor.
You must,
Yeah,
otherwise it's
okay.
infinite. This one has many possible combinations. There are 64 possible profiles, which means there's 100 and something possible pairs. Everything is a fractional factorial. There is only one paper that I'm aware of, as published in the Netherlands, that used a full factorial, but they presented it, it was done on radiology, and it was done to people who were used to doing radiology review of hundreds of cases. And there, the full factorial happened to be 124.
The next level is how do you arrange your pairs, triplets, or quads?
Okay, that's where you can't just take this. An orthogonal array can only make singles. It could make doubles here because I'm using the mirror image, the complete opposite. So I made the first thing, A, and I presented it with B, 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 B. But if there was a C, I couldn't use this strategy anymore. And that means I have to go to a package and say, I am making pairs out of a triplet, and I'm going to tell you whether I'm allowed overlap or no overlap. So with the one that Brett showed you, I'm not sure if you subtly noticed, there was both sides of the equation for some of them had the same answer. Mm-hmm. That's something that we could tolerate or not tolerate. And so these are all the rules. And once you feed that into a computer, it's going to spend a lot of time thinking about what the optimal design characteristics. And if I block out, you can never give this profile with that profile, or these attributes with those attributes, and you tell the computer that, it segments out the possible things. The Bayesian tool that I use generally now, when it doesn't crash the computer, generally takes about a day and a half to come to something reasonable. It would come to something even more reasonable if I let it sit for a week. So it is, but that's even telling it some certain parameters. That's not comparing, should I have offered 15 or 16 or 13 or 12? If I do that, and I quite often do it under certain circumstances, then I bring it back and look at the underlying model. Now, I could do that with an underlying model where I guess the answers and see how it responds, or I could do it under null hypotheses and see how it responds. Many different things are in play here that make it complex to kind of focus on. Oops, can't do that. Press the wrong button. So we're creating stimuli. In doing this, we're systematically varying aspects. We can kind of think about, I think we've talked about some of these issues here. It says fractional factorial, but all designs are fractional factorial. Most of them are main effects. Sometimes you could design on a non-main effects, or sometimes you can explore interaction terms even though you didn't intend to explore interaction terms. Sometimes if the interaction is a conceptual one, such as the attribute non-attendance, then I think you can model it post hoc. If you want to model an interaction, you have to tell it. The only way to model all possible interactions is to present each person with all possible profiles. So that means an infinite number of tasks to an infinite number of people. Then we can understand truth. That's burdensome. We'll actually end up, the other aspect here that we didn't really, when we wrote this, we were not focused on. There are some designs that will encourage people to use simplifying heuristics. We call this respondent efficiency. So there's burden, but then there are some questions that will cause people to just to go off on really, really weird tangents. So for example, if I show a task that is dominated, I show the best possible profile against the worst possible profile. It turns out that after somebody has seen that, they will move to much more frequently to a non-trading, they will go, if I've seen that, I can now just focus on the attribute that's most important to me. So there are some people that say, if you're going to present that task last. It's a validity check, the dominance task, but you want to put it at the end so that you don't bias. There are other kind of learnings that can be found in here. So we want to make sure that we've got identification. Efficiency generally has been focused on statistical efficiency. We now have this notion of respondent efficiency. I think that that's dealt with far more in the kind of work that we've done. I think we've talked a lot about the kind of different aspects associated with what's going on. Sufficiently identified, maybe not perfectly identified. I think Brett has mentioned about that. Generally statistically efficient. So I'm thinking about trying to minimize the standard errors in some way. Again, we can focus on the others. Where are the errors going to come from? There could be some choices, decision heuristics or other type of inconsistence, the fatigue, people misunderstanding. I did one where I was doing a focus group and I was actually doing it in a pharma company, and we presented the head person in the room, did their answers, gave their answers to the task that I showed you earlier on, and had the complete opposite than everyone else. And she turned around and said, oh, I thought I had to choose the worst. And so that's a face validity. Are people responding to the question that you're asking, something that you want to be checking? But there are sometimes other areas that were there. An example in my schizophrenia work, when we presented profile A, profile B to people with schizophrenia, they chose the profile that was most like them. They had an empathetic response. That's me. That feels like me. And then I went back to them and through the pre-testing, I says, no, actually we were asking which one do you prefer to be better. People with schizophrenia take things very literally. So we actually had to move to having a profile where there was Klaus and I forget the other person's name. It was done in Germany. There were two people's names, and we asked who did better. Here are two people's profiles. So sometimes we have to evoke other types of aspects. We have to also think about, as somebody mentioned earlier on, the hypothetical nature of this comes into play in some of what we're doing. I think we can go over orthogonality. We've got half an hour to go. The preference elicitation, there is kind of a discrete choice. Sometimes you can ask a scaled response. Sometimes these are nice, but they're difficult to then go and analyze. Sometimes we end up putting a threshold in them and presenting it as if it was a discrete choice experiment. So there's a difference between graded pairs and discrete choice experiment. There is the notion of having a reference case or an opt-out. Traditionally, what we would do is potentially have it as a two-stage question. Which of the two profiles are better? And then if this was the case, you potentially, so for example, in screening, it might be saying, which is the better way to do colorectal cancer screening? Oh, okay, now that you've chosen the best way, would you choose it if you had the opportunity not to do anything? Sometimes you have to do it with respect to a status quo. Generally, you're treated in this way. Here are some other possible ways, but you could choose to continue. So that's the difference between an opt-out, I don't want any of these, to a status quo, I just want to be done the normal way that everybody else has done. So for example, an example might be different types of LASIK surgery. The notion is, no, I'm happy to keep my glasses, and you might want to put that, if you're particularly interested in improving the benefits and risks of LASIK, it might just be a forced choice. If you wanted to model the percentage of people who have LASIK, you might need the status quo option. But it's not an opt-out, or even then it might be a status quo or an opt-out, I'm happy to be blind, or happy, so there are multiple things that you need to do. There is no absolute guidance with regards to using this. It is related to the context, it is related to the perspective that you're taking, and sometimes personal preference kind of plays in about how you want to model the particular situation. The other question here is whose preferences would you like to focus on? I think we've talked a lot about that already. There are kind of two other aspects, the instrument design and the data collection. I would prefer, these are well covered in the checklist. What I would actually like to prefer to do over the next 15 minutes is walk you through what we actually presented. I showed you the results of the cancer study that I did with longevity. Let's take a walk through, and I'll just highlight some of the issues. You might have some questions associated with this. So we have some buy-in, why we're doing it. We have the option that you could potentially do it on pen and paper, or if you wanted to do it electronically, you could do it at home. We had people in the room, research assistants, that could help you if you needed help, or if you needed to contact the responsible investigator, you could do so. We tell people how to fill the survey out. It's a pen and paper. We need that. We have to have the screening questions about eligibility and why you might be taking. Here we're allowing for both patients and caregivers to take the experience. We tell them there are multiple sections coming on. I like to start with the experience. Patient-centered research is also not just about explaining the preferences, but also where people are coming from. So I like to know the different types of cancer, the staging of cancer, where you are, the different treatments that you've had, some different therapies, your insurance status, and then this is a scale that is used elsewhere. Again, some people say, I'm doing a discrete choice analysis survey, or I'm doing a best-worst survey, a best-worst scaling survey. No, you're putting a best-worst scaling instrument or a discrete choice experiment on a survey. You can have other questions about that survey, about the people. You could be other reasons why you may want to understand the different functionings and other types of issues. We really want to do this. This is the kind of the meat of the survey. This is the instrument. This is what we're focused on, the results that you saw. We're going to think about, this is kind of like a brief summary. We're going to show some choices that vary in progression-free survival, short-term side effects, long-term side effects, and we can talk about, somebody said the different scales. I've already warned somebody that these things are going to be different on different scales. I'm also going to say there is some color coding that we're going to use to kind of think about when we're talking about severity. We're going to use this none, mild, moderate, and we're going to use some shading to kind of support that. End of page, if it was electronic. If it's paper, I continue onto the page to describe the first attribute. Progression-free survival. So we tell them some work. Now, very carefully how we have to kind of work on presenting this. This was both done with what has previously been done in the literature, what our patients wanted to do, and then we're kind of going to say, for the purposes of this, we're going to vary on some levels. We're going to have some short-term side effects of treatment. This is a warm-up task. There are multiple different types of warm-up tasks. I could have done a Likert scale. How important is this on? We want to engage people on what we're doing. This is a strategy that we worked with Brett group about putting a mini task on. I've used this on other lung cancer studies that I've done with Brett's group. And we present the little case study and kind of like saying, here, Sarah, it's not you. We're going to say people like you have filled out the survey and have done it in this way. Just so you can get a sense. So if I'm just going to have 5 pages of text or 4 pages of text describing the attributes, there's going to be pretty problem. So I want to engage why are we doing things, and I also want to get people familiar, not with that, oh, I know I'm only going to vote on short-term side effects and that's it. I'm going to start warming people up that you have to have some trade-offs. Then we go into our long-term side effects. We can focus on this. We're going to use, because I'm paralleling the CTCAE, I translated some of the wording. Now, of course, the CTCAE traditionally was focused on clinicians. There are PRO versions of it, but I'm going to have to focus on, maybe there are several dimensions on the CTCAE that focus on physical, and I'm making a composite out of that. And so we can think about neuropathy, chronic pain, muscle weakness. So I've created what's called a meta-attribute, something that could have been decomposed, but instead of putting all of these on, I'm kind of going to say I used a conceptual model to put these under a single component, but I'm going to have to do it. We can see that I'm describing it back again with regards to activities of daily living type of conversation. Then I've got the emotional, we can kind of work through. I've done 2 of them, and now I'm going to engage the person by letting them have a go. It's an example, but I want them to have a go at answering. This question is not in the experimental design. And you can see that it's only partial profile. These are the 4 that I've presented up until now. Now that I've got people engaged and starting to think, I can present 2 more before I do it. I'm going to, in this study, present 13. I've used, to generate these tasks, 12 of them are in the experimental design and 1 is a holdout task. I can't remember whether it's a repeated task or a specifically designed holdout task. There are 2 types of ways to judge the validity of this. Test, retest. There's an interesting paper that I've just written that'll be presented in Glasgow shortly that talks about the role of the test, retest. Because of probabilistically, I'm only going to map the probability that you're choosing A over the probability. Let's say 70% of respondents choose A over B. What would we expect? And under my notion, that's kind of like saying, hey, no, any respondent should have a 70% chance of answering A. So what would I expect in terms of, if I ask the question again, would I get the same answer? The answer is no, but how do you judge a deviation? If someone answers too consistently, it's a deviation from theory. If someone doesn't answer consistently enough, it's a deviation from theory. But that's a minutiae associated with this. So we walk through these tasks. You can see in my experimental design, I'm not overlapping. I think there might be 1 or 2 instances of overlap, but generally the experimental design that I'm working on is favoring not overlapping. I could have asked it to overlap, but I'm not sure that I'm going to see an overlap. Oh, cheap talk. You're more than halfway done. The evidence on these different types of cheap talk, there's no reason behind it. It's called cheap talk in marketing because you're just trying to encourage people to kind of move on. Sometimes it's beneficial. There are other types of cheap talk strategies that you could do, such as, hey, we're going to present this work to the FDA. We really need your input. Without your input, if you don't answer the next 6 questions, it's not going to be valid or something like that. There are different things that you could do to kind of think about this. Make sure that you consider all 6 aspects. I'm trying to encourage, maybe in our pilot work, we've seen people move towards lexicographic decision making. So we're just trying to encourage people to overcome the burden. When we've done this nationally, we've actually moved to the blocking design, and we're only going to present 9 in the experimental task and a 10th holdout. And then I moved to another experimental design where I made 10s with 2 holdout tasks. So there are kind of different strategies that I can do here. There is some identifiability issues in this design that is okay, but not perfect. So again, this is not a perfect design. There is some correlations going on. It's a simple design, but is problematic. One of the things when people use these programs, and I've done it before, where I said, oh, I think 16 tasks is right, or I think 8 tasks is right. One of the problems with 8 tasks here or 16 tasks here, there's no way to get level balance. Remember, I've got triplets. I am going to, that moderate there is, by the number of tasks that I presented, is going to end up on one side or the other. Make sure that the number of tasks, you might have 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s. Make sure the number of tasks that you have is a multiple such that you can still maintain level balance. I think in this study, we had some issues with that in some of the earlier work. This is an interesting set of questions that we have. I do this after each particular module of preferences. Did you find it easy to understand? Did you find it that you answered easy to answer all of the questions? And did you answer in a way that was consistent with your preferences? The norms on this, if I say that you have to be agree or strongly agree, the norms on this that I observe is generally in the 60 to 75% range, are up in the top 2 boxes. When we see, so for example, we had an instance on a similar study to this where it dropped to 40%. And the results of the model looked very, very strange. That was the study where I tried to minimize the burden. And all of a sudden, by minimizing the burden, I didn't have those warm-up tasks. I didn't have any, I minimized the explanation. I was worried about the total time of the survey and not worried about engaging them. And the numbers here took a really big nosedive. Doing a lot of work, I ended up actually getting them back up over 80% top 2 boxes on all these categories. Yep. No, you can do it with, two pairs, 3 triplets, and 4 5s. Making a combination where all of those can be still level balanced is complicated. So I love symmetry. So that's one of the reasons why when people come to me with serious problems, because I'm a methodologist, people come to fix, hey, we're having trouble with this. I'm also a journal editor, so I see some of the problems. Generally, it's about mixed attribute levels cause problem. This is my experience. Some people are comfortable with doing it.
Let's say you have a decent sample size and you have 60 or 70% agree or strongly disagree on that question. Would you look at the people separately who agreed and strongly agreed from folks who had more trouble with it?
We'll talk a little bit about this problem called scale. So we normally talk about error, measuring things with error. So let's say I'm an economist, I measure inflation, I could overestimate it or underestimate it. But generally my aim is to be unbiased. Over time I get it on average right. What happens in this task when somebody answers in a way that they didn't mean to? So I meant to choose person A, and I had what we might call trembling hand in game theory, and I accidentally chose B. What have I just done? But how serious an error? Okay. This one was better than that one, and I chose the wrong way. No. It's not going to be symmetric. When I make errors, I can only ever make errors biased towards the null. The null being I don't have preferences for any of this. I tell the opposite piece of information that I meant to tell. Let's say that there are some people who do that 1 in every 10 questions. But there are other people that do it 4 in every 10 questions. Both of them, there's sufficient signal to noise for it to work, assuming that it's not hitting specific tasks. There might be, if it hits a specific task, I might lose identifiability. But if it is at random, then what's going to happen is one of the groups is going to have parameter estimates that are biased towards the null. So they'll look the same in terms of their magnitude. Say they might be both monotonic in the same direction, but one will be stronger than the other one, even though they have the same underlying preferences. So
It's the same as when someone misunderstands the task and maybe partway through says, oh, this is what I should have been doing, or...
So changing your preferences will also bias you towards the null, because you'll have a mixed strategy, one trying to say one thing, one trying to say the other thing. When you compare the two of them, more often than not, the two of them could make a recipe to tell something completely different, but more often than not, it's going to bias you towards the null, because you wanted to send a stronger aspect on that, and then you move to a stronger aspect on that, but in the meantime, you've pushed everything back towards the null. Yep.
Maybe it's a broader question, but if you're thinking about specifically targeting a patient group with cognitive impairment, because that's your group is studying, how do you go about determining this group just can't get this?
Okay. So my work has been in, when I first did this, I was overseas, and I got asked to do schizophrenia, and I got really keen. I went, if I can get schizophrenia, then no one will ever, because everyone says, I'm working on aged people, I'm working on children. Everyone had a reason back in the early days that this was too burdensome for their particular group. So I went, people with schizophrenia in Germany. I couldn't think of a more unempowered population in the world. I asked the NIH in the US if I could do, if they were interested in funding this study, and they said, why don't you go do it on cardiac problems? Statins is a good research question, not schizophrenia medication. I've gone on and done, I think I've published 2/3 of the papers. I think there are about 18 papers out there now. I've published a whole heap on it, but I did a study where I actually sat down with them and asked, are you making sense of this? Do you understand what's going on? There was some noise, but I actually found that, and I've published this, that they were actually better decision makers than the psychiatrists. But they were really empathizing with the task a lot more, and I ended up getting good results. Brett, you have a recent experience.
Yeah, we've been working in whatever we want to call the Alzheimer's space, because we have called it something different. And we've been tackling that exact problem. And what it has turned out to be was kind of rounds of qualitative work yet. And we're not even, we know there's a group out there who have some level of cognitive difficulty, who can do one of these things. And we know if we may not be thinking about this correctly, we think of it as a continuum of decline. And what we're trying to identify is, can we identify the people, if there's a continuum of decline and there's a dividing line that says these people can and these people can't, we're trying to identify that. We are still in the process of doing that.
We're using the qualitative.
But right now it's all qualitative, because what we are having difficulty doing is identifying who's on which side of the dividing line through some sort of screening process, because what we thought we had that was pretty rigorous screening process is not doing the trick. So what we're going back and what we're seeing is inconsistent multiple screeners, and inconsistency in screeners is one thing that we're beginning to see is predicting who's on what side and who's on the other, but it's taken more rounds than we had anticipated. We did these face-to-face qualitative interviews to start, and we thought, wow, this is great. These people can do this kind of thing. Well, as it turns out, if an interviewer is in the room talking them through they meet these screening criteria. Some of them couldn't. So how do we weed those out? It's been a hard process. It doesn't mean it can't be done. It doesn't mean there's not a subset who can do it. The question is, how can we identify these in that subset? And we can figure that out.
I think it also, burden is one issue. The other question is emotional distance. How relatable are these? So for example, one of the issues with that study on Duchenne, the people who were getting upset were people with younger children, and we were talking about their children dying or their lung function giving in, and that was too distant for them. It was hard. I wasn't prepared to answer these questions. Other people may reject. So in some of the schizophrenia work, we were dealing with people who rejected that they had schizophrenia. We could work in that population, but I think that there are some other conditions, other behavioral conditions, for example, people who reject or have emotional problems, gender identity issues. We might think I know some people who've done some work in what do parents do when you have a non-binary gender. That's a hard, emotionally fraught question that is hard to deal with. Some people have the inability to answer it because they have not connected with the vignette. And so sometimes we have to get other people to answer on behalf of them. But the same things, in the circumstances where you couldn't get somebody to consent to a clinical trial, is probably an area where we might do this. Although I've just done one, for example, we're working in Prader-Willi syndrome, and we're playing around asking people with Prader-Willi syndrome what their preferences are, even though you would never accept somebody, an adult with Prader-Willi, consenting. You would always have them assent and somebody else consent. We're having difficulty getting access to that population, and I'm committed to one day going and doing it, but at the moment we're using parents as proxy decision makers.
Is the painstaking effort to make sure that you get answers that you can believe, so is there a noise set of research, or is it about just something about the design of the questions that you're asking that you actually need? I guess I'm surprised by virtue of if there's a population that wouldn't be a decision maker, if you're looking at decision making, then that's what I'm trying to.
That's a key point. There's a reason why we want to be able to talk to this particular group of patients, and it really is a lot of what we're aware of is in development that is for early onset to stop progression or slow progression. So that's the target group, and there is part of that target group that is going to be able to make those decisions, some alone or independently, and some who are not. So if we want to ask patients who can make that decision on their own what they think, that's really our goal, both for practical and ethical reasons, because we don't want to be asking people for whom they're unable to do it. And an example that we found out that makes Alzheimer's difficult in particular is especially people who have a spouse or other person as a care partner who takes on certain responsibilities for them. The person themselves may not be relating to the scenario because it's not something they have to deal with, or they would even know that they have difficulty with. Finances is the big one. We talk to many people who say, oh, my spouse takes care of my finances. That's never been an issue. I have no problems. It's a totally true statement and reflects where the person is coming from. So delaying decline in your ability to do your finances is not something that's relevant to them. So we have a compounding problem. But we want to get to that specific decision maker in this case with Alzheimer's, and it's been incredibly difficult to define who can we get to, who can do that. We can have lovely conversations, but our goal is to try and get something systematically quantitative. And for that, we need to get to the right people, and figuring that out has been our challenge.
Okay. There's one section left in the survey. Oops. And I tell them, hey, there's one section left. And this is about you. Some people would want to start with about you. we've found that about you is better done at the end. People don't like, because I do work in patient engagement, they don't like being broken down by age, race, and sex. Some people drop out. There is no protocol for any of the work that we're talking about. There is no protocol with regards to what to do with missings. We just haven't gone that way. There are so many other things that we've got a priority on. Generally, we'll just re-specify the denominator and report the data that we have. So what type of questions do we do? Gender, age, race, language, children, marital status, education, employment, income. Now, on some of my studies, I've worked with people who do decision psychology and that, and they wanted to put literacy questionnaire on, numeracy questionnaire, and then all of a sudden I've got, you know, a 32 question numeracy question and a 16 question. We've done that and shown that, you know, we do have social norms or we don't have social norms. We've never really integrated it. So the FDA in some of my submissions talked around, it's like, we just want to see ballpark, whether your population is just super freaky compared to norms. So we just put these questions on, and we've done it on some national surveys. So when we work in boutique surveys, let's say, for example, we've done a pilot in a patient organization, one of these researchers and events, we can just have some sense of where they're answering this regard. Generally, I consider these types of questions just potentially to describe my patient population. You may choose to put broader instruments in, but because I've spent so much time, I think that this survey, I can't remember what we billed this survey at the beginning, whether it was a 20-minute or a 40-minute, but these things are taking time. Increasingly, my stuff is going past the hour. This notion that I've jumped back on I'm less worried about burden, I'm more worried about having meaning. And so I try and get some questions about this. You're going to have to trade off this. Generally, the couple of times where I have gone fully blown diagnostic categories or spent money to try and get confirmed diagnosis or clinical medical records data or some other thing, you know, generally I end up not using it. Generally, the primary results, you know, I showed you the primary results from this study. They were impressive. They were a little bit skewed to educated Caucasian women, which is not unusual for patient organizations. But to say that it was magnitudes of order wrong, I don't think that we could say that. Some of it we've validated from other things. There's a literature that we can validate this compared to. It seems to make sense. And generally what we want to do here is present this data to decision makers that sometimes don't make sense. People who think, oh, that people will never make that trade-off, or people could never make that trade-off. And we're trying to provide some data that, no, it's possible, plausible, and here is some ballpark data with regards to the results. And we put some thank you in there. So we have time just for 5 minutes before we go on our break. We will be returning back at 2 o'clock, and Brett will be taking over, going on the theory and the analysis strategies. Then I'm going to show a real-world example. I was trying to show you the results that I had before, but because Ellen is still overseas, I'm going to show you the PCORI results. It's a similar survey, but I'm going to walk you through some of the strategies. The takeaway there, I don't expect you to learn how to code. Brett uses different program than I use. I sometimes, for some of the results that you would show, I'll show you that it's not quite valid, and we'll move on to there. And then Brett this afternoon is going to show some case studies. And I think that the case studies generally in our past experience have provided the aha moments or have solidified some of the questions that people have had throughout the day to kind of see how this is in practice. The one thing Brett made the point earlier on, despite all the issues that are play. You know, if you were working into a new methodology and somebody said there are 100 key decisions that you need to make, you might get a little bit scared with it. It turns out that the results are somewhat robust. You know, the people who have compared different strategies quite often have shown that I'm familiar with the experiments of experiments literature, even cross methods and all those other types of things. Generally, we see, even when there's a disagreement between two methods, say the p-values are different on a particular attribute, we show that overall, say, for example, the correlation between the attributes, the row, is like 93%. That's pretty strong. That's not comparing things at random. These things tend to hit the mark. The other aspect, we're not going to go over the last couple of points of the checklist, but the last point of the checklist relates to publishing, and it always begs the researcher, how do these results compare to what's already known? Other methods, other forum, lay literature, previous testimony, how to increasingly I'm interested in taking the responses back to the community and say, hey, this is what I found. I got rejected from a journal that I edit, and I took it back to my patient board and say, I got rejected for this reason. They didn't believe the conceptual model. And they went, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. They for these reasons, we totally wholeheartedly agree. And so we're boosted by that information to kind of go back and to pursue this. But, you know, there are, as Brett mentioned, peer reviewers that have particular angles that they're pushing. It's transdisciplinary, so I can run into a decision psychologist, I can run into an econometrician, I can run into a clinical person. The study that I showed you this afternoon is on diabetes, and I chose not to put weight gain on. Some people reject my work because I didn't. It's a model. Models aren't perfect. You have to make some trade-offs across them. The model was built for a very specific reason. I did community engagement, and I have on the record why we made the decision. Sometimes you regret some of those, but generally things are supportive. So one of my favorite researchers, Hilda Bastian, a patient advocate in the Cochrane movement, says, one paper does not evidence make. So if you're sitting and wanting to get this absolutely perfect, it's probably not the best strategy, because somebody will say, that's just one paper. It potentially would have been good to show a variety of methods, a variety of samples, a variety of researchers. Some of the work that I'm doing with FDA, we have East Coast, West Coast competitions to work on different strategies, and we're using different methods on the same research question to kind of show how there are similarities and differences across teams. Sample size calculations is just, there is some literature on sample size calculation, but it's only on statistical. I mentioned earlier on that there's statistical efficiency and respondent efficiency. The sample size calculations only are based on the statistical efficiency. You have to know the model that you're estimating, you have to know how you're estimating it, and you have to know how to collect the data. Under those circumstances, you could get a sample size. Sometimes, for example, NGene might spit out a very small sample size that no one would accept. Sometimes the sample size that's spitting out from NGene is that you need 10,000 people. NGene is a statistical a design package, but it has a built-in sample size calculator. The Bayesian approaches, if you tell it what the model is and you're doing a Bayesian approach, it'll tell you what your sample size is. But it's not consistent with practice. Generally, we have social norms about how much is there. Yeah, there are rules of thumb, but generally, despite that, 200 to 300 seems to work. If you're going to stratify or do latent class, you probably need 200 to 300 per group. No one's ever published any of this in New England Journal or JEMA, so we don't know what their requirements are. But generally it's field journals, outcomes research journals, and there's a whole variety. I've published as low as 15.
Can I just on sample size, if I may, and this is, so I'm going to get on the soapbox here for a moment. There is a very, very good paper on sample size factor by Rebecca Crowe from the Netherlands. And as John suggests, it talks about appropriate sample size for statistical efficiency if you know all these things. There's one key assumption in there or requirement in that calculation, and that is that you know that you have a good sense of your priors. work on sample size, and it seems to be in that 250 to 300 range is sort of the sweet spot for kind of a standard size that we're talking about. There's so many other variables that go into sample size, and often we don't know, unless there's a lot of literature already out there, what the priors will be, and I am terribly reluctant to say that I know what patients think, that I prefer to go in flat, and there I don't have a sense.
So in my recent study, the one that's in the field at the moment, I stopped 100 and I did a full run of the analyses, made all the graphs and said, if this was our final result, what would it be? And there were several instruments and we looked at it and it was just like, well, yeah, we could publish this at 116 observations. We could publish this. We could go to 1,000 if we wanted to. We could go all out and recruit for the next 6 months. I could probably get to 1,000. I don't think the story is going to change. 2 of those variables, I made one of the standard figures and 2 things were overlapping where I think that there really was a statistical difference. It observable, but it wasn't statistical yet. It was close. And so I went, I bet if we doubled or tripled the sample size. So I said, and I took it to my advisory board and I went, probably between 200 to 300. I don't think, unless you start coming with assumptions about subgroup analyses, I don't think that we will need to go past 300 on this data. But I might reanalyze again at 200 and see how the story is going.
Journals that aren't as familiar with the methodology, sort of having a fixation around response rate? Because it seems like if you have sort of a target, no, this is the problem that if you have a target sample, then actually the response rate becomes a little bit moot if you just need to be able to create stable estimates, and you just need to get to a certain number to do so. But then I don't know, like, had that been an issue or?
Yes, it has been a big issue. So yeah. We're going to leave it there because I actually have a mentoring lunch that I have to get to. We're going to come back at 2:30. Enjoy, have some time off. 2 o'clock, sorry, it's 12:30. We have 1.5 hours. And we'll see you then.